Hello everyone, my name is Gregory and this is The View from Out Here. Today I'm going to be talking about Israel. By even broaching this subject, I expect to be fielding a barrage of hatred and accusations of antisemitism. That's what happens to anyone who is critical of anything Israel does. U.S. foreign policy has always held that Israel can do no wrong. Now, I don't agree. Determining who the good guys and the bad guys are in this scenario depends on who you ask. To be honest, I don't think there is a good guy in this whole story. I've waited to wade into the subject of Israel because I know how sensitive the whole subject is. Conflict in the Middle East, of course, is nothing new. It was one of the topics for debate when I was in high school back in 1967, for crying out loud. Israel has been in almost continuous conflict with at least one of its neighbors ever since. One would think that at some point in this timeline it would dawn on the Knesset that every one of these conflicts has one thing in common. Take a guess. Right up front, I think it's important to make some distinctions. Israel is not the same thing as Judaism. Hamas is not the same thing as Palestine. When we conflate any of the four, we make untangling this mess even more difficult than it needs to be. Lisa Miller tells us that before Israel was established, Jews once considered a location in Argentina as a homeland for the Jews, which leads me to wonder whether the homeland for Jews necessarily has to be in the specific location where it is today. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu declared war against Hamas in response to a massive and bloody attack on Israel last year. The attack was a surprise to everyone as it was planned and executed in secret. It seems like everyone agrees that the attack was unprovoked and unnecessarily brutal to Israeli civilians. And I agree, mostly. 1,400 Israelis are dead, mostly civilians, and that is unacceptable. At least part of the problem is U.S. involvement. The U.S. needs Israel to represent democracy in the region because our national security interest, oil, is located mostly in that area of the globe. Therefore, Israel is kind of like Hawaii to us in practice. It could be considered the 51st United States. In exchange for our money, weapons, and protection, Israel will do whatever we tell them to do. But along with that exchange, Israel gets to do whatever else it wants with impunity, as long as they hold up their end of the bargain with the U.S. That's a lot of the reasons why, according to us, Israel can do no wrong. Paraphrasing Richard Nixon, if Israel does it, it's not illegal. Like, for example, introducing Jewish settlements to the territories that were set aside for Palestinians in 1948 and again in 1967. The famous set of maps showing Palestinian territories shrinking over the decades is an example of what I mean. The U.S. has turned a blind eye towards what amounts to slow-motion extinction of Palestinians in Israel. Jews claim that Palestinians have the right to exist, just not in the place where they've always lived. They need to move somewhere else. The problem is that no one, including us, is providing a homeland for the displaced Palestinians that Israel wants gone. It's just like our problems with homelessness here. Where are the people who are being driven out of their homes supposed to go? Now, what is puzzling me is why the U.S. doesn't seem to see the correlation between what Israel is doing to Palestine and what European settlers did to the native population that already existed here when we showed up at Plymouth Rock. It would be like the police coming to my home and telling me that God promised this living space to another family thousands of years ago, and that I have to stay in my room from now on. Gradually, this new family says that I make too much of a mess in the bathroom, so now I can't use that anymore. Then, it appears that I make too much of a mess in the kitchen, so I can't use that anymore. Then they block the entrances and the exits to the building. What am I supposed to do? So now, we have the same problem we had finding a homeland for the Jews in the 40s. Palestinians don't have a nation anymore because it was given to the Jews. I can understand why that would make somebody angry. All of this can be traced back to a religious text that was written by men and attributed to God that promised Jerusalem to the Jews as a homeland after wandering aimlessly in the desert for 40 years, a long, long time ago. Hamas and some Palestinians want Israel dead because they see Israel as occupying their home. Now notice, I didn't say Hamas wants Jews dead. Remember, we are making the distinction that Israel and Judaism are not the same thing. Never mind what's in my coffee cup. Shut up. As far as I know, Israel is the only sovereign nation in global history that was established by law rather than by conquest. As a sovereign nation, of course, Israel has every right to defend itself. But part of the reason they need to defend themselves is because of our involvement. Thus, they get to have nuclear weapons that scares the bejesus out of their neighbors, and they get to slowly extinguish Palestinians and still be seen as the good guy. The Hamas attack on Israel is, however, not entirely unprovoked. What Israel has been doing to Palestinians since 1948 at least ends up being tantamount to slow-motion extermination. Surely Israel couldn't legitimately expect Palestinians to thank them for it. And how is it that Jews in Israel don't see the correlation between what they are doing to Palestinians and what has been done to them for thousands of years? This reminds me of an anecdote a friend told me years ago. A scientist was in his lab conducting experiments on rats. The scientist approached the cage where the rat was living and he poked it with a stick. The rat moved away from the stick and went peacefully about its business. The scientist pokes the rat again, and the rat moves to another part of the cage. The scientist pokes the rat again, and again the rat moves to a different part of the cage. Finally, the rat is backed into a corner of the cage, and there isn't a path to go anywhere to avoid the stick. The scientist then pokes the rat with the stick again. And the rat attacks the stick. The scientist writes in his notes, "Rats are violent." Israel responds to Hamas's brutal attack by brutally bombing Gaza and killing upwards of 30,000 Palestinians, also mostly civilians. Israel, right now, has troops on the ground in Gaza, and the fighting continues. To Israel's credit, they are warning Palestinians about where they intend to bomb or invade while going after Hamas, which is a decent thing to do, of course. What I don't understand is what makes Israel think that Hamas can't hear them when they issue those warnings. Hamas can just step out of the path of the attacks, which in turn leaves mostly innocent Palestinians in the line of fire, and Israel knows it. This is not a proportional response, and this is not self-defense. This is something else. A powerful argument has been presented to me, point blank. Does Israel have the right to exist? Of course it does. But I don't believe that Israel has any more of a right to exist than any other nation does. Nations come and go and always have. To Jews, the difference is that Jews believe themselves to be the chosen people of God. I'm a Catholic, so am I. Now what? I favor a two-state solution. Israel does not and never really has. They are continuing to exterminate Palestinians based on the premise that God gave that specific location to the Jews. That ongoing extinction is being put on steroids as I speak this evening by Hamas with its attack last year, giving Israel cover to amp up the pace of that extermination. What you believe about all of this depends on what religion you are. It kind of makes you wonder what God thinks. With what Putin is doing to Ukraine and what Hamas did to Israel and what Israel is now doing to Palestinians, it would appear that killing innocent civilians with impunity is allowed now. Nobody who does it is being called to The Hague to answer for it. It has become the new normal. The rule of international law is being eroded by a conscious lack of enforcement, much like it is being eroded here in the United States with Donald Trump and the U.S. elections in general. I think it's a coordinated global effort. But this time, all of this is happening while Vladimir Putin attempts to delete Ukraine, side by side with a growing global trend towards authoritarian rule. It's even happening here in the United States. if Donald Trump doesn't win the election in November, there will be violence, and I fear it will dwarf what we went through on January 6th. This week on the Sunday morning news shows and press conferences at the courthouse where Donald Trump is on trial, MAGA publicans are lining up at microphones to question the fairness of an election that hasn't even happened yet. Oh, by the way, while all of this was going on overseas, back at home, the Republicans fired their Speaker of the House just as Hamas attacked Israel, rendering the U.S. crippled to do anything about it until they worked out a deal to bring us one Mike Johnson of Louisiana to the Speaker's podium. Johnson then assumes the gavel while bringing his Bible with him and placing it on the podium next to the Speaker's gavel. What could possibly go wrong? We learned recently that Speaker Mike Johnson is among the MAGA publicans that believe that the presidential election of 2020 was rigged and that Donald Trump is actually the duly elected president of the United States right now. Johnson voted against the certification of votes from all of the states that presented falsified electors to replace the legitimate ones. From where I am out here, Armageddon doesn't seem like some glorious religious orgasm of redemption anymore. Somebody in this global nightmare really needs to call off the dogs of war before things get out of hand, if they're not already. I want to thank you for hanging with me this far while I try to make some sense of our world. If you find something of value here, please take a second to like and subscribe, and don't forget about my books. You'll find links in the descriptions below. Meanwhile, my name is Gregory, and this has been the View from Out Here. Much love.